The world doesn't end with fire. It ends when boundaries stop holding. That's not how legends behave. That's how systems fail. Most lost cities leave something behind. Ruins, descendants, fragments, a sequel. Atlantis doesn't. No confirmed coordinates. No agreed location. No aftermath anyone can trace. No evidence anyone can verify. Something more precise. No coordinates that everyone agrees on. And that detail matters more than it sounds. So ask this. If Atlantis was just a story, why does it read like documentation? There's something else about Atlantis that people rarely notice. We argue about where it was. We argue about whether it existed. But almost no one asks why it was written the way it was. Because the structure of a story tells you as much as its content. And Atlantis isn't structured like folklore. It isn't structured like poetry. It's structured like a report. And reports aren't written to inspire. They're written to document. And that brings us back to Plato. Atlantis enters history through Plato, not through poets, not through folklore, through measurements. He gives distances, he gives geometry, he gives material lists, canal layouts, rings of land and water. He gives numbers for a reason. He specifies scale, he specifies ratios. He describes outer rings and inner sanctuaries with measured precision. If this were symbolic, abstraction would increase over time. Instead, specificity increases first, and then stops. And that's unusual, because myths grow. They expand. But this one doesn't expand. It compresses. Whether it's history or philosophy, Plato writes Atlantis with logistics. Even critics struggle to explain why an allegory would be written this way. This isn't how myths normally behave. Myths escalate. They branch. They multiply versions. Atlantis doesn't. It appears once, fully formed. Then the text cuts off mid-story. And that cut matters, because the account doesn't fade, it terminates. So ask the uncomfortable question. What kind of story deletes itself instead of evolving? Most legend cycles leave traces, descendants, secondary tales, regional variations. Atlantis leaves none, no folklore trail, no descendants, no cultural aftershock. Not because it was destroyed violently, but because it doesn't behave like a narrative meant to survive. If Atlantis were symbolic, symbolism would spread. If it were propaganda, repetition would follow. Instead, we get a single, dense record that doesn't invite retelling. That's not how myths persist. That's how case files close. So the real question is this: why preserve the measurements if the story itself isn't meant to continue? Here's the structural difference most people miss. Destruction leaves debris. Wars leave ruins. Floods leave sediment. Collapses leave layers. Destruction is chaotic. It leaves witnesses. It leaves noise. Sealing leaves a clean cut. Sealing is controlled. It leaves gaps. It leaves silence in the record. When something collapses, people talk. When something is sealed, records thin out. Atlantis leaves silence. Not because nothing happened, but because whatever happened didn't explain the shape of the story. It doesn't read like catastrophe. It reads like shutdown, like closing a system instead of watching it collapse. And that distinction matters. This isn't a story about conquest. It's a story about containment. Something was closed. Something was removed from circulation, and that's the tell. What kind of event deletes the sequel? This is where discussions usually get sloppy. Yes, there are real examples of submergence. Doggerland could be a confirmed landmass drowned by rising seas. Dwarka, contested. Partial structures, debated interpretation, ongoing research. These are confirmed or contested submergences. But then there are others. Mu, Lemuria, These don't behave like places, they behave like labels people attach later, so we need two categories. Confirmed submergence, Doggerland. Contested Dwarka claims. Mythic echo, cultural placeholders, Mu, Lemuria. Atlantis doesn't fit cleanly into either. It's described like infrastructure, but remembered like absence. So ask why. Why does it sit between geology and mythology without belonging to either? Plato doesn't describe Atlantis like a legend. He describes it like a city diagram. Rings, canals, metals, power distribution. It's written like a schematic, not a campfire story. Stories survive by being retold. Systems survive by being maintained. And systems don't fail randomly. They fail at stress points, boundaries, load capacity, overextension. And then there's the timeline. Atlantis doesn't decline slowly. It disappears abruptly. Systems don't always explode when they fail. Sometimes they just stop. No spectacle, no visible wreckage. Just silence where coordination used to exist. Even the text reflects this. The account itself ends mid-transmission. And this matters, because systems don't die the way stories do. Stories fade, they distort, they evolve, systems fail. Then they're sealed, and once sealed, they don't leave narratives. They leave gaps, which means Atlantis may not be a location, but a template, a repeatable failure pattern, not a missing place. We map faster than we verify. We label before we understand. We name before we confirm. And sometimes the label survives, while the system it pointed to is gone. We've seen infrastructure fail without visible damage. Financial systems freeze. Communication networks stall. Power grids cascade quietly before anyone understands what's happening. Not because they were destroyed, but because their internal agreement collapsed. Atlantis may not be a city we lost. It may be a pattern we keep recreating. Advanced systems, overextended boundaries, load pushed beyond tolerance, failure modes that don't leave wreckage, only silence, not impact, not invasion, not fire, overload. And when coordination breaks, the structure can still stand, even as the system inside it stops responding. And we've seen that pattern before, not in myths, in systems that stop responding. So ask the uncomfortable question, if Atlantis was just a disaster, why does it have no aftermath? If it was just a myth, why was it written like engineering? And if it was neither, how many times since have we built something that vanished the same way?